January 17th, 1945. Somewhere west of the Rhine, in a cold American rear area lit by truck lamps and a weak winter moon, the air smelled of coal smoke, wet wool, engine oil, and something the German prisoners could not place at first. It was sweet, warm, almost absurd. Not the hard smell of ersatz bread, not turnip soup, not the sour fatigue of a barracks kitchen running on fumes. This was pastry. Cinnamon, perhaps. A brown crust cooling in a metal pie tin beside a field stove, while beyond the canvas walls engines kept idling in the dark, one after another, as if the war itself had grown a heartbeat made of pistons. The men who noticed it had already seen stranger things in these last months. Columns of American trucks so long they seemed to erase the horizon. Fuel drums stacked like village wells, crates of rations, blankets, tires, radio sets, replacement boots, coffee cigarettes, chocolate batteries, canned meat, and shells. Yet this small, impossible dessert unsettled them in a different way, because if an army could still make pie in winter, near the front, in a ruined continent, then the war was no longer only about courage or marksmanship or sacrifice. It was about something deeper and colder than battlefield bravery. It was about whether a civilization could keep feeding complexity into the furnace without breaking. And on a tray beside that pie tin, cooling under the dim yellow light, lay the answer. There were no apples. There did not need to be. The Americans had found another way. That is why this moment matters. By the last winter of the war in Europe, Germany was still capable of killing, still capable of counterattack, still capable of shocking violence, as the Ardennes had just proved. But it was no longer capable of matching the industrial metabolism of the coalition it had provoked. Before the United States fully entered the war, Adolf Hitler had dismissed the idea that American mass deliveries of planes and war materials could alter the outcome. He believed, as many in Europe believed, that the United States was rich but soft, noisy but unserious, a country of commerce rather than destiny. Even older German prejudices had described Americans as a people too engrossed in the hunt of the dollar to produce a strong military force. Yet Franklin Roosevelt had already named the true battlefield years earlier, when he called on the nation to become the great arsenal of democracy. That phrase was not poetry alone. It was a production order, a political doctrine, and a warning that democracy would have to prove it could organize steel, rubber, calories, labor, shipping, and time more effectively than dictatorship could organize fear. To understand the shock of that pie tin, one has to leave the front for a moment and step into the American home front, where abundance did not mean the absence of limits. It meant the management of limits. In May 1942, the Office of Price Administration began rationing consumer goods to ensure the armed forces got what they needed, and to prevent the inflation and hoarding that had scarred an earlier war. Coupons and stamps governed sugar, coffee, meat, gasoline, fuel oil, tires, shoes. Millions of Americans learned a new grammar of citizenship in the language of restraint. What could be bought? What had to wait? What could be substituted? What could be stretched? Food changed. Cookbooks changed. Advertising changed. Kitchens became quiet training grounds in logistics. Housewives, bakers, grocers, and children were pulled into the war not only through patriotism, but through arithmetic. The point was not simply deprivation. The point was controlled flow. A democracy was teaching itself to count carefully so that somewhere far away a transport convoy would not stall for lack of rubber, a bomber plant would not pause for lack of metal, a rifleman would not go hungry for lack of freight priority. That is where the deeper meaning of the mock apple pie lived. Americans did not win because they had unlimited comfort. They won because they could preserve the ritual of comfort while redirecting the substance of the nation toward war. Out of that discipline came one of the great transformations in modern history. The American economy did not merely expand during the war. It reconfigured itself at a tempo that seemed unnatural even to those living inside it. Gross national product more than doubled from $99, $7 billion in 1940 to nearly $212 billion in 1945. Defense spending surged from $1.5 billion to $81.5 billion. Unemployment virtually disappeared. Millions moved across the country into new war towns and factory belts. Private firms were coaxed, paid, pressured, and inspired into retooling their assembly lines. By October 1940, William Knudsen's team had already arranged hundreds of contracts. Ford built the mile-long Willow Run line and by March 1944 was producing nearly one bomber an hour. By war's end, American manufacturers had turned out more than 96,000 bombers, 86,000 tanks, 4 million trucks, and 5 million rifles. This was not abundance as luxury. It was abundance as throughput, not a full pantry, but a civilization capable of moving matter through design, labor, transport, finance, and discipline on a scale no European general staff had truly imagined. And that abundance floated. It crossed oceans. It appeared at docks, railheads, depots, and beaches. By the beginning of June 1944, Britain and the United States had assembled in the British Isles the greatest concentration of men and materiel ever gathered for an amphibious attack. By July 1st, less than a month after D-Day, nearly 1 million men, more than 500,000 tons of supplies, and 177,000 vehicles had already been landed in France, despite the lack of fully functioning ports. To read those numbers too quickly is to miss their emotional meaning. Every one of those vehicles needed fuel. Every gallon of fuel needed a tanker, a drum, a hose, a schedule, a guarded road, spare parts, mechanics, and clerks. Every rifleman needed food, ammunition, dry socks, morphine, batteries, letters, replacement clothing, and eventually another truck to move him forward again. German doctrine had long prized operational brilliance, speed, concentration, the decisive blow, but by 1944, the decisive blow in Western Europe had become an accumulation rather than a stroke. It arrived in crates and convoys, in engineer depots and replacement pools, in fuel calculations and tonnage tables, in an invasion so mechanically sustained that its very dullness became terrible. Then came the breakout, and with it, the revelation that even the planners had underestimated the speed of their own success. Once Allied armies burst from Normandy and raced across France, supply lines stretched to the point of crisis. Here lay one of the great paradoxes of American war-making. The same momentum that shattered German positions also threatened to outrun its own fuel and ammunition. Another army might have slowed into paralysis. Instead, the Americans improvised a road empire. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began. For 82 days, truck columns rolled forward almost without pause. At its peak, 132 truck companies operating 5,958 vehicles carried 12,342 tons of supplies in a single day. Over the life of the operation, more than 420,000 tons moved toward the front. On an average day, 899 trucks were sent forward. The Army transportation history would later call it a classic American can-do response, made possible by the industrial might that had already produced more than 800,000 2.5-ton trucks during the war. No other army possessed such a motorized bloodstream. No other army could bleed fuel so lavishly and still remain alive. For German soldiers, this was not how war was supposed to feel. They had been raised in a military culture that revered hardness, austerity, and the moral prestige of suffering. Shortage was recast as virtue. Complexity was distrusted unless it served command. Improvisation existed, but it lived closer to desperation than design. Many of them expected the Americans to be over-equipped and undercommitted, dangerous in comfort, but brittle under strain. They expected noise without depth, firepower without endurance, wealth without steel in the nerves. What they met instead was an opponent whose very comforts had been militarized, whose civilian habits of mass consumption had been turned into war logistics, and whose softness did not collapse under pressure because it was not softness at all. It was reserve capacity. Beneath the cigarettes and chewing gum, beneath the hot coffee and clean socks, there was an immense administrative skeleton: quartermasters, shipping boards, engineers, signal corps, port battalions, inventory systems, procurement officers, and transport companies. The Americans did not merely bring supplies to war. They brought the habit of supplying. The front, from the German side, began to feel less like facing an army than standing before a conveyor belt that had learned to shoot. And this is where the pie returns, because the pie was the domestic version of the same principle. The old mock apple pie was not born in victory parades. It belonged to earlier scarcities and substitutions, a trick of baking memory into ingredients that were not what they claimed to be. In wartime America, such recipes returned with new dignity. Crackers could become fruit, Spice and acid could summon the ghost of an orchard. The point was not to fool the tongue perfectly. The point was to preserve morale, form, ritual, and the familiar architecture of abundance, even when inputs had changed. This mattered because war is fought not only by armies, but by civilizations trying to convince themselves that life will still resemble life tomorrow. Somewhere in a stateside kitchen, and later somewhere near the front, or in an occupation mess, a cook could crumble crackers. Add sugar where sugar was allowed, lean on lemon and cinnamon, pour the filling into a crust, and send to the oven the small doctrine of American power. If the expected ingredient is gone, the system does not stop. It reroutes. That is what the German prisoners smelled that winter night. Not simply dessert. Substitution made confident. Imagine the emotional contrast inside the mind of one of those prisoners, a composite of many defeated men. He had marched through villages where German supply wagons once rattled by in careful order. He had believed, at least in part, the regime's assurances that democracies were weak because they were divided, that comfort produced decadence, that pluralism produced drift, that only a state forged in hierarchy could endure a continental war. Now he stood under American guard with frost on his collar, staring at a pie tin beside an army stove. He had expected scarcity to infect the enemy just as it had infected Germany. He had expected the winter to strip everyone down to essentials. Yet the essentials, for the Americans, somehow still included sweetness, still included crust, still included coffee and heat and replacement gloves, and enough fuel to let engines idle while the dessert cooled. The pie did not humiliate him because it was luxurious. It humiliated him because it was organized. Its meaning was bureaucratic before it was culinary. It said that behind the front there existed a whole nation still functioning, still scheduling rail cars, still financing contracts, still shipping flour, still printing ration books, still landing crates, still patching trucks, still producing spare parts, still believing that ordinary life deserved to survive even inside war. There was another revelation in those convoy lines, and the Nazi worldview was poorly equipped to absorb it. Approximately 73% of the truck companies in the motor transport service of the European theater were African American. Many of the men driving the Red Ball Express were black soldiers serving in a segregated army that still denied them equality at home. That contradiction must not be softened. American democracy in 1944 was incomplete, compromised, stained by its own racial hierarchies. And yet, even within that injustice, the regime Germany had built its identity upon was being defeated in part by the labor, endurance, and technical skill of black Americans moving ammunition and rations across France night after night. Imagine what that meant to a system founded on racial myth. The trucks that fed Patton's pursuit, the trucks that kept divisions moving, the trucks that transformed operational daring into sustained pressure, were often driven by men whom Nazi ideology had already consigned to inferiority. The road itself became an argument. The convoy became a rebuttal. Under dictatorship, hierarchy had to be absolute to remain coherent. Under democracy, contradiction could become energy. That did not make democracy innocent. It made it adaptive. The Americans' abundance also carried a moral texture that German soldiers and civilians sometimes found unsettling. Even older German observations of Americans in occupied areas had remarked on the relative informality between officers and enlisted men, the lack of iron distance, the unfamiliar ease with which authority moved among ordinary soldiers. To militaries raised on rigid caste, this could look at first like looseness, even slovenliness. But looseness was not the same as collapse. In a democracy, authority could sometimes afford to look less theatrical because it was reinforced by systems larger than parade discipline. A truck arrived whether the lieutenant was elegant or not. The fuel dump was inventoried whether the officer's boots shone or not. The pie was baked whether the baker wore braid or none at all. That, too, was part of the shock. German military culture had long aestheticized control. America industrialized it. One did not need a perfectly staged hierarchy if one had spare parts, road signs, field telephones, accounting forms, trained mechanics, and a population already accustomed to large organizations. The German state had worshipped command. The American war machine worshipped flow. By late 1944 and early 1945, this difference had become existential. Germany still possessed brave soldiers, competent officers, lethal weapons, and a capacity for tactical damage. But courage could not manufacture fuel. Skill could not replace locomotives as quickly as bombing destroyed them. Fanaticism could not keep tires from wearing down. Ideology could command sacrifice, but it could not command supply into existence. The United States, by contrast, could lose ships and build more, burn through trucks and replace them, fire mountains of artillery ammunition and replenish stockpiles. This was not magic. It was the consequence of a society that had fused industrial scale to political purpose. The National World War II Museum summarizes the production miracle in stark figures: hundreds of thousands of aircraft, millions of weapons, millions of trucks. The Army's own histories record the monstrous scale of vehicles and supplies landed in Europe. The Red Ball Express alone moved over 420,000 tons. When such numbers entered the battlefield, they changed its psychology. A German soldier might survive a barrage, but what unsettled him was the knowledge that another barrage could always follow, and another tomorrow, and food after that, and fresh boots after that, and replacement man after that, because somewhere beyond the clouds and roads lay a civilization, still multiplying itself. And so the symbolic object changes in meaning as the war moves on. At first, the python is merely domestic, almost laughably small beside armies and frontiers, but then it becomes a mirror of the larger system. Empty, it waits for contents. Filled, it holds shape. Heated, it transforms, substitutes into reassurance. Cooled on a sill or a crate, it announces that something orderly has happened. For the Americans, perhaps it meant home, a farmhouse table, a county fair, a kitchen not yet dimmed by casualty telegrams. For the Germans who saw it or smelled it or heard the scrape of metal on a serving spoon, it could mean something else entirely. Not decadence, not waste, not naive plenty. It meant that the enemy was so deep in resources, so practiced in reconfiguration, that even absence had become usable. Apples missing, then use crackers. Port unavailable, then use beaches. Rail bottlenecked, then use truck convoys. Labor short, then widen the workforce. Tire scarce, ration civilian driving. Metal needed, re-engineer coinage. Democracy, for all its noise and inequity in political bargaining, could absorb shocks by redistributing strain across millions of people and thousands of institutions. Dictatorship could command magnificently. Democracy could replenish. There is a temptation, looking back, to reduce this to economics, to say simply that the richer side won. But wealth alone does not explain the pie. Many rich societies rot under stress. Many materially strong states become brittle because pride prevents substitution, because bureaucracy becomes vanity, because ideology forbids adaptation. The deeper American advantage was cultural as much as industrial, a familiarity with standardization, a tolerance for improvisation inside systems, a mass market already accustomed to distribution chains, repair networks, interchangeable parts, advertising persuasion, and the emotional management of desire. The same country that sold refrigerators and automobiles and breakfast cereal could, under pressure, redirect those talents toward Liberty ships, bomber wings, K-rations, fuel convoys, and a pastry that pretended crackers were apples. Even the deception was honest in its own way. Nobody truly believed crackers became fruit. The act was not denial. It was morale by ingenuity. It was society telling itself that form could survive disruption. And on the battlefield, that same belief became terrifyingly concrete. Form would survive disruption. The convoy would detour. The bridge would be replaced. The shell stock would be replenished. The pie would still come out of the oven. For some German soldiers, this changed more than tactical expectations. It altered the meaning of what they had been taught about the modern world. Nazi ideology had mocked liberal societies as weak because they dispersed authority, because they tolerated difference, because they were entangled in commerce, consumption, private interest, and argument. Yet by 1945, the evidence all around them suggested the opposite. Commerce had become transport mastery. Consumption had become production scale. Argument had not prevented national mobilization. Private firms had not blocked state action. They had been harnessed into it. Individual comfort had not erased military will. It had created reserve. Even the American soldier's informality, his less theatrical distance from officers, hinted at a political culture in which men were not merely tools in uniform. That did not make the American war effort gentle. It was industrial war on a vast scale, and it killed with relentless efficiency. But it suggested it by clean blanket, by the hum of idling engines in the snow. They had expected the Americans to rely on abundance as a luxury. Instead, the Americans used abundance as a method. They had expected shortages to level the field. Instead, the Americans treated shortage as a routing problem. They'd expected hierarchy to outperform democracy under pressure. Instead, they found democracy, for all its flaws, turning diversity of labor and wealth into continuity of force. In that sense, the pie was not comic, it was strategic. It was the home front made edible. It was an empire of roads and factories translated into crust and spice. And that is the epilogue this moment deserves. In war, freedom is often spoken of in banners and speeches, in constitutions and battle cries. But freedom also reveals itself in quieter forms, and whether a society can organize without strangling itself, whether it can sacrifice without worshipping suffering, whether it can substitute without losing memory, whether it can keep ordinary tenderness alive while building extraordinary power. The pie tin on that winter night held more than dessert. It held the secret that some regimes never understand until too late. Abundance is not merely having much. It is knowing how to keep life going when the expected thing is gone. A dictatorship can seize bread. It can order men forward. It can command silence. But a freer civilization, even wounded, can teach millions to adapt together. It can turn ration books into armies, contracts into disturbing truth to those raised under total command. A freer society, under mortal threat, might become more formidable than a regimented one because it could draw power from more directions at once. A dictatorship concentrates force. A democracy circulates it. Then the war neared its end, and the pie tin cooled again. Perhaps in a requisitioned German kitchen, now run by American personnel. Perhaps near a prisoner stockade. Perhaps only in the imagination of a man who had smelled cinnamon once and could not forget the insult of it. By then, the larger pattern was undeniable. German civilians and soldiers moved through landscapes where American trucks passed in endless files, where depots seemed to generate new supplies overnight, where food appeared not as miracle but as administration. The front had become a lesson in paperwork delivered by artillery. Somewhere behind every shell burst stood a clerk. Somewhere behind every warm meal stood a ration system, a shipping schedule, a warehouse, a contract, a farm, a mechanic, a road crew, a code book, a payroll office, and a voter. That last part mattered. The arsenal of democracy was not only a slogan about output. It was a statement about political legitimacy, a government that still had to persuade, still had to manage citizens rather than merely terrorize them, had nevertheless marshaled the productive strength to cross oceans and break empires. That realization could not easily be digested by men who had been taught that freedom was disorder. So when the title says German soldiers saw Americans bake apple pie without apples and knew the war was about supply, the deeper truth is not that a single pastry changed their minds in an instant. It is that the pastry condensed a revelation already arriving by convoy, by airlift, by artillery crate, by gasoline drum, by replacement boot to bombers, highways into lifelines, and a handful of crackers into the taste of an orchard that is not there. In the end, that was part of what defeated the Reich. Not only the gun, not only the tank, not only the bomber overhead, but the larger and more patient power behind them. The power to replace, replenish, reroute, and still remember what home was supposed to taste like. And in the long, cold dark of Europe, as engines murmured beyond the canvas and the pie tin slowly released its fading warmth, even defeated men could sense the larger truth. Freedom, when organized, is heavier than tyranny. It carries more, it lasts longer, and somehow, even in winter, it still finds a way to feed the future.